So Sean, maybe let's start at the beginning. What got you into trade compliance? What really drew you to it is something that I ask everyone because everyone has a very different story.
Sure. I fell into the industry, which seems like is kind of where a lot of folks, right? Because it's not something that's widely known. It's not something that's talked about, in high school or even in
Yeah.
college, really, right? So I just kind of fell into it at a hiring fair that I went to one day. And I was actually on my way out when who ended up being my supervisor and manager then saw me looking at the sign and we're just asking questions. So that's how that started. And then just kind of snowballed from there and was offered an analyst position. So started out as a trade analyst, learning how to classify for the US, and then that went into Canada and Mexico, Schedule B, and then, other countries from there, and just kind of dove into it. I love researching in general. So it kind of really meshed well with that, right? Because it's all research based. It's knowing where to go, where to look for something, right? It's not necessarily that you can just like regurgitate information, but it's that you know where to go to find the information to get to the correct answer. So, it's all these different items and where does it go, right? And more importantly, where does customs tell you it goes? Because you could think it's whatever it is, and customs could have a completely different perspective on it, right? I like to use the Matrix movie as kind of like my example or way to explain customs. There's
Yeah.
that scene where Neo is in the like office or the living room really of the Oracle waiting, and then there's that kid with the spoon, and he's all like, "There is no spoon." And I tell people, I'm like, "We're all Neo." And customs is that kid going, "There is no spoon," but we're all like, "That's clearly a spoon. I'm pretty sure it's a spoon." So that's kind of how I feel about it, right? That, and when we look at everything, right, it all has a number to it, right, within the tariff. So the world has a number, right? These laptops have a number, the screens have a number, right? So, but yeah, so I've gone through a lot of different commodity types, automotive, high tech, heavy machinery, above and below ground mining equipment, retail space now. So kind of all over, right? And they all have their different challenges and their different nuances that are within there. And for me, I like getting into cross and just digging in to figure out like how customs logic is working within these different commodity spaces.
Awesome. I love the matrix analogy.
Right.
Talking about classification, since you've spent a bunch of time on that, walk us through the scale at which some of these operations were. I've seen companies who may have just a handful of items to classify, but then you have automobile companies who may have hundreds of thousands of parts and perhaps more than a million as well. So talk us through the scale. And what I want to dig into is, because 1,000 products is very different than 100,000 products. So what really breaks? What changes? How do you think about processes when you have to, deal with that kind of scale? That I think would be very helpful tactically for our audience.
Certainly. So when you're talking the scale of, what it is, when you talk to somebody like, we'll use an automotive manufacturer, right? Like the big three, they're dealing in millions of parts. And then it's hundreds of thousands of parts depending on where they're coming from, right? And they use a part logic type system. So it's easy to build rules around that when you're doing it. So you can take large groups of parts and be like, all right, if it's this prefix and base and this part of a suffix, maybe, right, depending on what it is, we know that it's always going to be this based on, you still need to do all your due diligence and everything else and say like, all right, it's always this within this model year, right? Or this particular type of vehicle. So other ones you might have to do a little bit more research, but it's still quicker, right, to go through it. So you can do groups of, 10, 20 or 30 or 100 at a time, going through and checking, right? You check your engineering systems, you check your blueprints and whatever other technical data that you have to use as your reference. And then you use that to kind of build out your note. You're like, I call it like your breadcrumbs. So if customs ever came knocking, you can be like, we started here and we ended up here, and this is how we got there, right? Smaller operations, right? They might not have these more advanced tools or enterprise level tools just due to the cost of what they are, right? And they're becoming, I would say, more accessible now within the last, 3 to 5 years than they were maybe 10 to 15 years ago.
Mhm.
to have, the ability to use like a rule-based logic auto classification. So, or auto class for short, right? To auto classify some of these things, right? So it would be like something like, this is a men's t-shirt and it's predominantly made of cotton. So it's always going to go here, right? Same thing, men's t-shirt predominantly made of polyester. It's always going to go here. So using those types of rules, you could help automate some of your classifications when you're doing it. And then you still need to put it through that final review check, right? So you want to make sure that it's good. So you're going to run an audit, right? Like a risk-based audit on anything that is auto classified to say like, yes, it's working correctly, right? We're going to take, a sample of our, men's cotton t-shirts and check it. Is that accurate or is it not accurate? So I would say that that's kind of like the way that I've gone about it and the way that other folks in the industry, right? That's how I learned how to do it too was, use auto class where it makes sense for those, kind of like everyday run of the mill type things where it's really cut and dry to get there. And then the other things that aren't, right? That's where you're going to want to spend your time and dedicate your hours to, because that's where your greater risk is going to be in those things that are going to be more complex.
Got it. And on average, whenever you had to classify something new, maybe the answer is it depends, but how long would it typically take, say, a junior classifier versus a senior classifier for something new? Let's take a new automobile part.
So yeah, I mean, for any part, if it's new and somebody's never done it, they're getting into the industry, they want to figure out what the item is first, right? So you want to check your section notes, your chapter notes, cross. Like I said, I like cross. I think cross is a great resource to use because it gives you that insight into the logic that customs is applying to how they classify, right? And then there's even other times where, different years they might change their logic up. So you always want to try to use your newest rulings, and then usually when they're that big of a discrepancy, right, they'll revoke it or modify it. But, I'd say a newer person, it's going to take them a little bit longer, especially depending on what the commodity is, right? If it's, something basic, you know, 10, 15 minutes to do a part, when you're a bit more advanced into it, you know how to navigate those tools faster, right? So, 5 minutes maybe. So, it all really just depends on what the item is and what the information available to you is, right? Are you getting good data, good resources to know what it is that you're trying to classify?
That last part is super important, I guess, because the less you know about the part, the harder it is to classify, I suppose. So what did that process look like across the various companies? I know you worked at a company which was perhaps a service provider
Mhm.
for other companies, and maybe you worked in-house as well. So maybe you can talk a bit about the in-house process first, where how did you receive that information? And if it was less information than ideal, was there an established process to get more info? Like, what would you recommend for teams that are putting together a group of classifiers today?
Yeah, I think the process should be the same, whether it's in-house or not. It's just in-house, right? You kind of have maybe a more direct line to the folks that are going to have the information, right? Or the tools, right? Maybe it's easier to access those, right? So your downtime is less. But that might not always be the case, right? Because maybe the internal team didn't think to ask for the information. So the data that you were given just didn't contain it. So now they have to reach out to somebody. And the factories overseas, right? There's generally a 24-hour delay, we'll say, right, in getting that information back. So I think overall, though, the process is the same, whether you're internal or external, because the data needed to come to a compliant classification is still the same requirement, right? It doesn't change whether it's a Fortune 500 company or a mom and pop.
Understood. And what did your tool set look like when you were classifying or when you were leading a team of classifiers?
So, leading a team is a little bit different, right? Because you're not necessarily involved in the day-to-day classification of the items, right? You're more involved in like the auditing of the items. So you're looking at everything that the team may have done and then, applying a risk-based module or model to that rather. And, you're looking at those. So you're looking in more in depth, right? You're doing that more in-depth research. So you're spending more time on it, going through, checking the blueprints out, checking the different systems that may have referenced in their note for that item, what it was, what it is, where they got it. If it was an email that they got from an engineer, was it the right engineer or right supplier or any anything that was listed, you want to kind of do that verification, that double check on that information to verify it. And I can tell you that's paid dividends. Doing the research and having the correct information that you're using to come to validate your classification is everything, right? Whether it's, the client could have their own team that audits you, and then you need to validate where you're going, right? Because you're proving your worth to them. On the other side of it, it's customs. If they send you a 28 or 29, you need to make sure that your logic is essentially bulletproof to defend it, right? It's not just thrown out there and be like, well, we've always been doing it this way, so that's just how we do it.
Hmm.
There was cases where an internal team came back and they were questioning where an item was classified, and it happened to just so be something that I had also caught in one of my audits from the team. And, they were trying to say, well, we talked to this engineer and he said that it's just off the shelf and, we can just buy it whenever we want at any type of store. And that wasn't the case. It was actually made from a mold that was for that specific item or model of item, right? And they had various sizes depending on the actual model, but they were made to order and only made for that client. So it wasn't off the shelf, right? Well, come to find out, right, that engineer they spoke to didn't even work on that model of machinery, had nothing
Hmm.
to do with it. He was an engineer, but not for that. So he was providing information that was inaccurate based on his own assumptions, essentially. But having done the due diligence and following up with everything, we had the receipts, so to speak, to back it up. And, their manager that was performing the audit too was like, hey, thanks for showing that, all of this is there and that I need to now go back to my internal team and say, hey, these are the processes. You guys need to be at this level too. Cause right. I mean, it doesn't look good for their internal compliance team if they're not actually doing the due diligence.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's an amazing story. I think making assumptions is probably like a very big mistake. You need to just find that piece of evidence or data that you can use to back things up. And a lot of times I've heard people completely rely on the engineering team, but as the story shows, it's not necessary that the engineer also knows the right answer or the right data.
Correct.
Great. And it does seem like a pretty cumbersome process for you to review things for like for a fairly large team. I'm just wondering, like, was this all this information shared over email? Was it over Slack? And for you to then go and check where they got it from, did you then have to dig into email, dig into chats? Like how did that actually work when you were reviewing their work side by side?
So we had our own internal tool software that we used, and everything was stored in there, right? So the note was in there, the classification was in there, and then we had separate, like client folders within our software, so we could, attach everything, so you could just see it. It was pretty easy to get to. And I also had all the access to all those client tools as well, so I could log in and check it and see it firsthand, right? Because we wouldn't save like engineer drawings and things like that. We would reference it. We'd say like this system, whatever, and then you'd look up that part number within that system, and then you could see all the information back on it.
Got it.
On the smaller, right, that's on the larger side. On the smaller side of things here, right, it's not as set in one specific like software space, right? It's a little bit more pieced together where, things are done, via live samples or, test results or through email, Excel, right? It's a little bit more of that like lower tech day to day type of technology, right? I guess we could say, that people use to transmit that data and share that information. So, while it's not a web based, software tool from like, Fortune 500 company, it's, more just granular data, but it's still data at the end of the day, right?
Yeah, yeah, that's true. So in a sense, for record keeping, you had a system where everything was basically worked off of that system. So, in case you have an audit, you can always refer back to that record. Maybe even if it's like 2 years ago, you'll be able to pull that out. So that's great. Can you tell us a bit about how you thought about building out the team? Meaning, let's say me as an individual can do 50 classifications per day. Let's just take a number, right? How did you assess, hey, here's the volume that we are going to get. Next year, perhaps the volume is going to go up by 25. How did you go about structuring the team? What were those numbers on average look like? It'll just help other leaders kind of design their teams as well. So if you can talk about
Yeah.
that.
So I mean, again, that's a little bit different too, right? It's going to come down to the commodity that you're doing, the information available to you. That all plays into it. So I always like to do time studies with multiple individuals on, the same sets, so that way everybody does it, and then come up with an average, and then be like, all right, this is our average we're going to do for imports. This is our average we're going to do for exports related
Mm.
to this commodity type, right? So automotive, you could do a lot more, right? There's sound part logic. So it makes being able to go through and do it a lot faster and a lot easier. On the other side, right, some of the stuff might be just one off. So it's just that one. So there is no more part logic. So you really have to dig into the parts a bit more, right? So even though your description might give you, some good information, right? Like it might be like, it's a 10 millimeter hex head screw. So you'd be like, all right, cool. But what material is it now? So now you got to dig into it, right? But if you've got hundreds of those and they leave out just the material, now you've got to go in and you've got to look at each one. And if there's no part logic to it, right? That factors into your time. So I would say the best way to go about it is to you perform a time study, you use multiple individuals, and then you come up with your average from that.
I think, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then would you allocate that average time for classification as a task, or would there be additional things that you needed to plan for so that you can then say that, okay, I need 5 people versus 8 people?
Yeah, it's gonna really come down to, those details within it. Like what is the scope of work looking like? Like does the client know, like, hey, on average from the last 3 years, we brought in 10,000 items. And then I would ask for a breakdown of what does 10,000 items, were they all the same, or is it a whole bag of different items, right? So, getting into those details is where it's really going to come down to knowing, right? And then ask for the historical data too, because when you do that, you can bring in the other opportunity to audit what was done in the past, right? Because anything 5 years back can come back to bite you. So you want to look at it, audit it, and you might find some things that, were previously wrong. So then you want to get those updated, to being correct and compliant. But, building out that library will also help you as well going forward with your, time to complete basically. Because then you have a reference point. You can be like, it's this, so it's always going to be here.
Got it. Let's dig into audits, because that's another important, super
Mhm.
important topic, and you never know when you're going to get audited. Has that happened to you? Like audits just came out of surprise. Can you talk a bit about what happened, what kind of questions were asked, and how were you prepared in order to answer those questions?
Yeah, for sure. So, yeah, different types of audits have happened, right? Internal, have had questions come from customs on, different items from, some of those client teams. And the way that, I kind of, it still follows that same kind of logic, right? Like making sure we have our breadcrumbs so that we can get back there and we're not just willy nilly assigning it, right? And I would say it's one of those things that's just kind of, unfortunately, with some folks, right? They'll go with whatever's the lowest duty, but not
Yeah.
necessarily the correct classification. And then just hoping that maybe their volume is low enough that it doesn't get caught.
Hmm.
And, it might, I mean, it could be, something like, somebody might, I don't know, let me think of a quick example. Something might, maybe they're trying to bring in something and they're just like, well, it's decorative and it's mainly made of, resin. So it's just a decorative plastic item, right? 39 and call it a day. But really it's, like a tabletop waterfall. And the essential character of that is the waterfalling. Well, customs has ruled that the pump that pumps the water, that's the essential character of it. Because without that waterfall, nobody wants to buy it. It's just a decorative landscape, right? But that's not how it was marketed. That's not how it's sold. It's sold as a tabletop waterfall, right? So it's going to go as the pump. So that would be the correct classification for that item, right? It's not. So if you did get caught in that, how would you justify that you put it in 39? You really don't have it unless you were like, well, we don't import it with the pump. It's without the pump. If somebody wants to add it later on, that's on them. They can buy a pump and do it. But if it's coming with that pump, it needs to go with that logic that's been laid out in multiple cross rulings.
And no, that's a great example. Typically, when it's an external audit, what really happens? Like, do you get an email from CBP? What do you have to do after that? Like, do you know how that works?
Yeah, so from the few that I got, they were sent to the client, and then the client sent them on to us, and then we responded back, providing all the rationale, collecting all the documents, sending everything back, engineer drawings, things like that to, reinforce the classification that was provided.
Okay.
And the few that I was involved with, I never had anything come back past it, where they wanted more. We were able to provide, everything to justify where it was and to satisfy their curiosity, we'll say,
Mhm.
right? I always think of that, right? Like 28 is more like they're poking around trying to see if there's some holes in it, right? To go further. But yeah, and then I would even say that it applies internally, right? I kind of use that same logic with the internal processes. It's like, all right, if customs came knocking, do we have enough to back up where it is? If it's a no, then we need to do more. We need to, you know, bolster our process around making sure that we're compliant in all areas. So what failed? What is it that failed? Was it that we were just told it was X and then we got something else and it had Y on it? And why did that change? And how come it didn't get caught? So I'm big in making sure that there's redundancies built in. So if I get it right, I want to get it in an email and in another document somewhere else, right? That says, it is made of this or it is made of that, things like that.
Understood. And whenever you get this type of an audit, how long do they give you to come back with an answer?
So they'll give you a time frame on when they want your response back,
Yeah.
and I'm gonna brain fart on the time frame now.
But it's sufficient enough for you to go back in like a couple of
Yeah, yeah,
weeks.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
It's not like you get it and then like an hour
Yeah.
later they want it
Okay.
back
It's
again,
not
right?
like a
They give
hard
you a
deadline.
time frame on when they want that back.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. I don't know why I can't think of it now off the top of my head.
Yeah, makes sense. And on the internal stuff, do you do it in such a way that you make sure that a part is classified by, say, two people so that you can see if they come up with different classification codes? Because then that's like a good discussion to have. Or is it that people are so busy that you can't afford to do
No, no, you definitely want to do that, right? And then if you're on a bigger team, you're gonna have different levels, right? You'll have your senior analysts, and then like your regular analysts that are working on the different teams, right? And your senior analyst usually is handling more of like your project parts, your live parts, and then like your junior analyst or your newer analyst, right? They're going to be doing kind of more of those like day to day type of things that you see a lot of, right? They just come through, right? Because that helps one, it helps build up their confidence. It's lower pressure, so they can focus more on the process of getting to a compliant classification than worrying about like having to hit like a number, right? Because you don't want somebody to rush through it
Yeah.
to where they're more focused on the number than they are on being compliant part. They're like, well, I did my 15 parts in this hour and I was able to do that all day long. That nobody wins in that situation, right? The company loses, the client loses, you lose, your team loses, right? So for me, it's always more on being compliant than like trying to rush out stuff. And I want to add around the parts piece. Having talked to a lot of different folks, being in the industry for a while, right? Being on multiple different sides of it, it really depends, right? Like some folks are going to be more of that audit level type of research into it, right? And they've even flat out said like, we do maybe 6 parts an hour. And
Mhm.
I was like flabbergasted. I was like, six parts an hour? That seems pretty low, and then, on the service provider side, talking, depending on what it is, 50 parts an hour, right? Or 30 or 40, whatever it might be, right? So, having those two different experiences is pretty, stark in their differences. So it's like, well, how did you get here, right? But and it's service provider versus service provider, but the other one is more on like that audit level of classification rather than like seeing the same stuff over and over.
Yeah, yeah, makes sense. You did talk about using some type of system internally to record keep and to store your classifications. And we've seen a bunch of AI tools perhaps also crop up in the last couple of years. So, what's your take as a classification leader? What's your take on AI? I mean, software is one piece, but AI, natural language processing, all of that has also taken off. So, what's your take on the use of such tools within the trade compliance teams?
I think it's you know, I don't think anything else, right? It's a tool that we can add to our tool belt to help us get to where we're going. As far as using it, right? You can't use it to do the final decision. It'll be wrong. I've helped beta test and I've looked at a lot of different tools, right? A lot of people have reached out, hey, we've built this tool. What do you think? Use it, try it out, give us feedback, things like that. And I mean, some are better than others. But, in the same time too, some of those ones that were on the better side, they took a lot longer to do to give you a result on just one. And even on that one, I was still able to trick it. So, and I mess around with that myself, right? You know, Building out agents, things like that. And even within that, it still trips up itself. So it's not, it can't replace a person. I don't think maybe in time it will, but customs has ruled that you can't use it to do it that way. So we have that for us. But, just from all the different things that are out there that I've, seen, talk to folks and even just doing myself, it's a good resource to have to bounce ideas off of or to maybe see what it picks up that maybe you missed, trying to read through all the different rulings and things like that, right? It can do that a bit faster, but it can still be wrong. So you still need to do that double check really is if it was a person doing it and giving you the information or if it's, some AI agent or AI tool doing it, giving you the information. You still want to give it that final validation check.
Yeah, absolutely. And in your experience using or testing these tools, and you said you've also tinkered around building some of these, where do they really fail today? Is it on the identification of the code? Is it on telling you back the logic why that code was chosen or and not some other code? Where is the essential difference between how a expert human classifier would do versus how these tools are performing?
It's a mixed bag. Sometimes it's within how it's interpreting customs logic. Other times it's within the HTS code where it's, maybe it reviewed an older ruling. So it's then now providing you this invalid HTS code that's been replaced by something new, right? Sometimes it's, just at the, 9 and 10 digit level. Other times it's, completely wrong and it might only be good for the first 4 digits. So it's a mixed bag. Like I said, sometimes it's that logic. And so then I've found that I'll go out and find newer rulings and older ones and feed it those and it goes through its process and thinks about it as like yes, thanks for doing this, I appreciate it. I have a better understanding of the logic that customs is trying to convey between the original ruling and this newer one. Other times though it's been like what I call like stuck on stupid and it still gives me back an invalid HTS code even though I tell it like only reference this current HTS, this is your source of truth. Don't use anything else. If it does not exist, don't give it to me. And it'll still be like, yes, you're absolutely correct. This is the correct HTS code. And I'm like, we just covered that this does not, and it does not exist in the current tariff, right? It doesn't exist. Why are you trying to provide this as, and it'll use the terminology like this is a customs compliant classification. It's like, no, it's not. It doesn't exist, So, I mean, and I guess that would still be the case if it was somebody new, right? They might read that ruling, not double check it in the actual tariff to verify that that's still a valid code. They might be like, well, customs put it there in the ruling,
Yeah.
right? So, it's like training a new person, right? That's getting into the industry.
Yeah, yeah. No, makes sense. I think these are not just in this industry, but even other industries where these hallucinations or things that get stuck on are common challenges, and that human review, whether it's legal work or whether it's finance work or classification work, I think that human in the loop is like an extremely important piece. Would love to understand more about what you've started recently. How are you creating value for your clients? Who do you want to work with? Tell us about your consulting gig, Shawn.
Yeah, so it was just something I always thought about doing, and to just be completely transparent about it, it just kind of happened. I wasn't looking to make it live because I was still like kind of building it and playing it out. And when it was like, do you want to make this live and notify? And I was like, no, I don't want to do that yet. I'm still doing it. And then all of a sudden, like, I like switched out of LinkedIn and went back to doing whatever I was doing. And then I noticed I was getting all these emails and congratulations and all this other stuff, super cool. And, and I was like, what is everybody talking about? That's weird. And then I looked at my email. I was like, oh, I guess it's live now. So I guess it's out in the ether. So I guess it was just meant to be. So, but it's, it's been pretty cool, and made a lot of new connections and new networking opportunities with folks. So having lots of discussions across the board, anywhere from like these podcasts to possibly some export auditing, even training. So training I think is a big piece, and I think it's something that is usually left internally, right? There's lots of like webinars and things like that happen, and sometimes they might be like an on-site thing, or sometimes they're online, but it might be hard to follow. So, or maybe they're done a certain way, right? I don't know. I don't know how many you've sat on, but I've sat on a bunch of other ones, and some are great, and other ones seem to kind of get lost in the noise and they lose their purpose. So, just kind of taking it as it comes in. And one thing that I've always liked to say is the opportunity lies just outside of your comfort zone. And any opportunity can come knocking, and if you don't open the door and at least take a step through it and look around to see what's there, right, you could be losing out on something great. So it happened for whatever reason. It ended up getting out there in the ether, so I'm just kind of running with it and taking it as it comes in. Not pushing it hard or anything like that, just letting it naturally occur.
I think that's great. The universe will just send you
Yeah, right.
customers, friends, new people. I think that's awesome. Just to close out, I always ask this: what's a trade story that you would share with your grandkids?
Boy, great story. It's if you're curious and you like research, I think that this is a great place, right? Like I can get bored easily with other places. If you name it, I've probably done it. And this industry has a way of keeping you engaged. It's always changing. There's always something new to learn, right? Whether it's customs changing its mind, it's the government changing its mind. It's products changing or items changing, right? There's always something new to learn. So every day is different, right? It's not wake up, rinse, repeat, right? Some of the processes are going to be that way. But as a whole, I feel like it's a dynamic day. You never know what's going to pop up, right? The IEPA tariff stuff, right? Everybody's waiting on the 29th. Well, wake up yesterday, today, run your reports. You might have some refunds that showed up ahead of time, right? It's a great way to start your Friday to notice that you got a nice chunk of change that came back to you. So, I would say and it's the people part of it too, right? Everywhere I've been, I've worked with great people. And that people connection piece is what I really like out of it, right? Getting to meet folks, getting involved, and not coming from a place of like, these are the numbers, we got to do this, right? It's like that's part of it, but the people are the other part of it, right? We all have lives, life happens. This stuff is always going to be here, right? So it's nurturing both sides of it.
That's awesome. That's a great tip for the grandkids to listen to. This has been great, Sean. Thank you for sharing your stories, your learnings, and yeah, hopefully it was fun for you too.
It was great. I appreciate it. It was my first podcast. So
Amazing.
yes,
Glad to
first
have you.
professional podcast. I've
Yeah,
done some other things on YouTube with a buddy that has a car channel. So, but
awesome.
I really enjoyed this, and I appreciate you reaching out and giving me the opportunity to meet with you.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Thank you so much, Sean.
Thank you. Bye.